The deafening crack of a gunshot split the morning air as Grace Holloway clutched her feverish 5-year-old daughter Emma to her chest, ducking instinctively behind the worn counter of her small general store. It wasn't bandits this time, just another drunken cowpoke shooting at bottles in the alley, but in Calico, California. 1878. A widow with a sick child couldn't be too careful. Grace tucked a loose strand of auburn hair behind her ear and gently laid Emma down on the makeshift pallet she'd arranged beside the store's pot-bellied stove. The little girl's forehead burned against Grace's palm, and the wet cough that rattled from her tiny chest squeezed Grace's heart like a vise. "Mama," Emma whispered, her blue eyes glassy with fever, "is Papa coming home today?" Grace swallowed hard. 3 months had passed since Thomas Holloway had walked out their door with the last of their savings, promising to return with medicine for Emma and their fortunes restored. His final words, "This town's dying faster than the silver mines," still haunted her nights. "Rest now, sweet pea," Grace murmured, avoiding the question as she dampened another cloth and placed it on Emma's forehead. "The doctor will be back through town next week." The bell above the store's entrance jingled, and Grace hurriedly wiped her eyes, plastering on the practiced smile of a shopkeeper. Business was business, even with her world crumbling. "Be right with you," she called, rising to her feet. The man who stood in the doorway blocked the morning sunlight, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the worn floorboards. Dust covered his denim pants and the leather chaps that protected his legs. His dark blue shirt was faded from sun and washing, and the bandana around his neck was pulled up to shield the lower half of his face from trail dust. As he removed his hat, revealing thick mahogany hair in need of a trim, Grace recognized him as one of the cowboys who occasionally rode through with cattle herds headed north. He'd stopped in a few times for supplies, but had never spoken more than a handful of words. "Madam," he said, nodding politely as he approached the counter. His voice was deep but gentle, with an accent she couldn't quite place, perhaps somewhere back east. "I'm in need of some supplies." Riding with the Olsen outfit, moving cattle up to Emma's coughing interrupted him, the sound harsh and worrying in the quiet store. The man's eyes, a startling green, shifted to the corner where the child lay. "Your little one sounds poorly," he said, concern replacing the formal politeness in his tone. Grace nodded, her composure threatening to crack. "She's been sick these past 2 months. Started with a simple cold, but it's settled in her chest." The cowboy's brow furrowed. "Your husband not around to help?" The question, innocent as it was, broke something inside Grace. Months of stoic endurance crumbled as tears welled in her eyes. "He left," she whispered, the admission painful. 3 months ago. Said he was going to Sacramento for medicine and work. Never came back." The cowboy's jaw tightened beneath his stubbled cheek. He glanced again at Emma, who had fallen into a fitful sleep, her breathing labored and wheezing. "That child needs a doctor," he stated. "Nearest one's in Barstow, and he only passes through here every few weeks," Grace replied, wiping her eyes with her apron. "I can't close the store to make the journey, it's all we have left." The man was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. Then, with deliberate movements, he set his hat on the counter and began rolling up his sleeves. "Name's Matthew O'Brien," he said. "I was riding with that cattle drive, but they can manage without me." "Mr. O'Brien, I don't understand. Your daughter needs care and you need help." His voice was matter-of-fact as he removed his dusty bandana. "My pa was a doctor back in Boston. I picked up a thing or two before I headed west." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "I can't pay you if that's what you're not asking for payment." Matthew moved toward Emma, kneeling to place a calloused hand gently on her forehead. His touch was surprisingly tender for a man who worked with cattle and horses. Pneumonia, most likely. Seen it before. But your job, Matthew looked up at Grace, determination set in his features. Madam Mrs. Holloway, is it? She nodded. Then I'll stay till you're both well, he said simply, as if promising to remain with a desperate woman and her sick child was the most natural thing in the world. Grace felt her knees weaken. You don't even know us. A faint smile crossed his face, softening the weathered lines around his eyes. Don't need to. My ma raised me to believe a man's measured by what he does when no one's watching him. He stood, rolling his shoulders. Now, you got any wild cherry bark in this store of yours? And honey. We'll need to make a tea for that cough. For the first time in months, Grace felt a glimmer of hope kindle in her chest. She nodded, turning to the shelves behind her to gather the items. As she did, she caught her reflection in the small mirror hanging on the wall and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time, a spark of life returning to her tired eyes. The next few days established a routine. Matthew slept on a bedroll behind the counter of the store at night, insisting Grace take the small bedroom at the back with Emma. During the day, he split his time between tending to Emma and helping around the store. His knowledge of herbal remedies surprised Grace. The poultice of mustard and flour he applied to Emma's chest seemed to ease her breathing, and the teas he brewed gradually reduced her fever. Customers were equally surprised to find a cowboy behind the counter of Holloway's general store, but Matthew handled them with unexpected efficiency, tallying purchases and restocking shelves as if he'd done it his whole life. Never would have taken you for a shopkeeper, Grace remarked on the fourth evening as they sat at her small table, sharing a simple supper of beans and cornbread. Matthew smiled, the expression transforming his trail-hardened face. 8 years driving cattle makes a man appreciate walls that don't move and a roof that doesn't leak. He glanced toward the bedroom where Emma slept more peacefully than she had in weeks. How'd you end up in Calico? It's not exactly a gentle place for a woman alone. Grace's fingers traced the worn edge of the tablecloth. Thomas, my husband, he heard about the silver strike, sold our farm in Missouri and moved us out here 5 years ago. Emma was just a baby. She sighed. He worked the mines while I ran the store, but the silver started playing out last year. Men began drifting away, looking for the next big strike. And Thomas went with them, Matthew concluded quietly. Grace nodded. He said Sacramento first, then maybe the gold country, promised to send for us. She looked up, meeting Matthew's eyes. I stopped believing that promise about 2 months ago. Matthew's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of comfort that sent an unexpected warmth through her. Some men weren't made for putting down roots, he said. Doesn't make it right what he did. And you? Grace asked. What are your roots, Matthew O'Brien? His smile turned rueful. Pulled them up a long time ago. My father was a respected physician in Boston, expected me to follow in his footsteps. I even started medical school. He shook his head. But after the war, I couldn't settle. Too many ghosts, I suppose. Headed west and never looked back. The war changed many men, Grace said softly. That it did. Matthew's eyes took on a distant look that told Grace he was seeing battlefields instead of her small kitchen. After a moment, he seemed to return to himself. Emma's fever's breaking. Another week of rest and those herbal teas, and I'd wager she'll be running circles around both of us. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. I don't know how to thank you. No need for thanks between friends, Matthew replied, rising to clear their plates. Besides, I haven't felt this useful in years. Being a drifter doesn't exactly feed the soul. As he washed the dishes, insisting Grace rest, she watched his broad shoulders and efficient movements. There was something about Matthew O'Brien that made her feel safe for the first time since Thomas left. It wasn't just his physical presence or his care for Emma. It was the quiet integrity that seemed to radiate from him, a steadfastness that Thomas had always lacked. The thought brought a flush to her cheeks. It wasn't proper to be comparing her husband absent as he might be to another man. Yet as the days passed and Emma's health improved, Grace found herself increasingly aware of Matthew's presence. The deep rumble of his laughter when Emma told him stories, the gentleness of his hands when he checked her forehead for fever, the way the sun caught the auburn highlights in his hair when he stood in the doorway of the store. A week turned into 2, and Emma was well enough to sit up and help sort buttons and ribbons in the store. Matthew had taken to repairing the sagging porch steps and patching the leaky roof tasks Thomas had always put off. When a delivery wagon arrived with supplies Grace had ordered months ago, Matthew negotiated a fair price and unloaded the heavy barrels and crates himself. "You're making yourself indispensable," Grace commented as they worked together to stock the new inventory, Emma playing contentedly with her rag doll nearby. "Just earning my keep," Matthew replied, though his eyes lingered on her face a moment longer than necessary. "Mr. O'Brien fixed my doll's arm, Mama," Emma chimed in, holding up the toy. "He sews even better than you do," Matthew chuckled. "Field medicine has its uses, Miss Emma, though your mama's cooking beats trail food by a country mile." The easy domesticity of their days began to feel dangerously natural. Grace found herself wondering what it would be like if this arrangement wasn't temporary, if Matthew stayed not just until Emma was well, but permanently. Each night as she lay in bed, she chastised herself for such thoughts. She was still a married woman, even if Thomas had abandoned them. And Matthew was a drifter by his own admission, unlikely to settle in a failing mining town. Yet something was changing between them, subtle as a desert sunrise. It was in the way Matthew's hand would brush hers when passing items across the counter, in the quiet conversations they shared after Emma was asleep, in the growing comfort of their silences. On a warm Saturday afternoon, when the store was closed and Emma was napping, Matthew suggested they take a short walk to check on a spring he'd discovered just beyond the edge of town. "Thought we might expand your garden come spring," he explained as they walked side by side along the dusty trail. "Good water source and the soil's decent. Could grow more than just those scraggly tomatoes you've been nursing along. Are you criticizing my gardening skills, Mr. O'Brien?" Grace teased, enjoying the fresh air and the rare freedom of walking without worry. "Wouldn't dream of it, Mrs. Holloway." His smile crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Though I did notice your carrots are more the size of my thumb than my finger." Grace laughed, the sound surprising her. How long had it been since she'd laughed freely? "And I suppose you're an expert gardener as well as a cowboy and medicine man." "Hardly," Matthew admitted. "But my mother kept a garden that fed half the neighborhood. I was her designated digger and waterer from the time I could carry a bucket." They reached the spring, a small but steady flow of water emerging from rocks and creating a patch of green in the otherwise brown landscape. Matthew knelt to test the water, cupping it in his hands. "Sweet and clean," he said, offering her a handful. "Taste." Grace leaned down, her hands covering his as she sipped from his palms. The water was cool and refreshing, but it was the intimacy of the moment, his hands forming a vessel for her, the closeness of their faces that made her breath catch. When she straightened, droplets of water clinging to her lips, Matthew's eyes followed the movement as she wiped them away. For a breathless moment, she thought he might step closer, might cross the invisible boundary they'd both been careful to maintain. Instead, he cleared his throat and turned to survey the area around the spring. "We could divert some of this water with a small channel. Wouldn't take much work to irrigate a proper garden plot." "We," Grace repeated softly. Matthew looked back at her, his expression unguarded for once. "I know I said I'd stay till you both were well, but—" He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Calico's not such a bad place to stop for a while." Hope fluttered in Grace's chest, but caution tempered it. "What about your job, the cattle drive?" "Plenty of work here for a man willing to do it," he said. "Already spoke to Miller about helping with his freight business. He needs someone who can handle teams and isn't afraid of the desert routes." "You'd stay in Calico." Grace couldn't keep the wonder from her voice. "Why?" Matthew's gaze was steady, honest. "You know why, Grace." The use of her given name, spoken with such quiet certainty, made her heart race, but reality intruded her reality with all its complications. "I'm still married, Matthew." The words were painful to speak. "In the eyes of the law, if not in practice." "I know." He nodded, respecting the boundary she'd just drawn. "And I wouldn't ask anything of you that would compromise your principles. But I can still be a friend to you and Emma. Can still help make your lives a little easier." The generosity of his offer brought tears to Grace's eyes. This good man was willing to stay to help, to be near them, asking nothing in return that she couldn't honorably give. "Emma adores you," she said finally. "And I've grown accustomed to having you around." A smile slowly spread across Matthew's face. "High praise indeed, Mrs. Holloway." The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of the town's church bell, reminding Grace they needed to return before Emma woke. As they walked back, a comfortable silence between them, Grace felt both lighter and heavier, lighter for the hope Matthew's decision to stay had kindled, heavier for the complications her unresolved marriage created. But for now, it was enough to know he would remain in Calico, that tomorrow would bring his steady presence and quiet strength. What she didn't know was that tomorrow would also bring unexpected news that would shatter their fragile equilibrium. Grace was rearranging merchandise on the shelves the next morning when Sheriff Wade Carlson pushed through the door, his weathered face solemn beneath his gray mustache. "Morning, Grace," he said, removing his hat. "Need a word if you've got a moment." Matthew emerged from the storeroom, carrying a crate of canned goods. The sheriff nodded in acknowledgement but kept his focus on Grace. "It's about Thomas," the sheriff said, and Grace felt her heart stutter. "Got a telegram from Sacramento yesterday evening." Grace gripped the edge of the counter. "Is he—" "He's alive," Sheriff Carlson assured her quickly. "But he's in some trouble. Got himself arrested trying to rob a bank." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. Thomas, a bank robber. The man had his faults, but she never would have imagined him capable of that. "There must be some mistake," she whispered. The sheriff shook his head. "No mistake. He confessed, hoping for a reduced sentence. Said he was desperate for money to send back to his family." He paused. "He's asking to see you, Grace. Says he needs to explain himself." Matthew set down the crate, his face unreadable. "How long is his sentence?" "Looking at 15 years, unless he can provide information on the other men involved." Sheriff Carlson sighed. "It's a mess, Grace." "But I thought you should know." After the sheriff left, the store felt suffocatingly quiet. Emma was playing at a neighbor's house for the morning, giving Grace space to absorb this shocking news. "What will you do?" Matthew asked finally, his voice carefully neutral. Grace pressed her palms against her eyes. "I don't know. He's Emma's father. She asks about him nearly every day." "Do you still love him?" The question was direct, painful in its simplicity. Grace looked up at Matthew, seeing the guarded hope in his eyes. "I loved the man I married," she said honestly. "But that man wouldn't have abandoned his sick daughter or turned to robbery. I don't know who Thomas is anymore." Matthew nodded, accepting her answer. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it, but don't go to Sacramento alone if you choose to see him. Would you come with me? Grace asked, surprising herself with the request. Something flickered in Matthew's eyes, pain or perhaps resignation. If that's what you need, yes. But Grace, he stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Just know that my feelings won't change, whatever happens with Thomas. The unspoken sentiment hung in the air between them, acknowledgement of an attachment that had grown beyond friendship, but remained constrained by circumstance. The journey to Sacramento was arranged for the following week. Mrs. Miller, the blacksmith's wife, agreed to watch Emma and mind the store. Matthew secured seats on the stagecoach and made discreet inquiries about legal options should Grace need them. Emma took the news of their journey with mixed emotions: excitement that they might see her father, confusion about why he was in a place she couldn't visit. "Is Papa in trouble?" she asked, as Grace tucked her into bed the night before their departure. "Yes, sweetheart," Grace answered, choosing honesty over evasion. "He made some bad choices, but we're going to talk to him and figure things out." Emma's small fingers traced the pattern on her quilt. "Will Mr. O'Brien still stay with us when Papa comes home?" The innocent question pierced Grace's heart. "I don't know if Papa will be coming home, Emma, and Mr. O'Brien," she faltered, unsure what to say. "I want him to stay," Emma declared with childish certainty. "He doesn't make you cry like Papa did." Out of the mouths of babes, Grace thought, smoothing Emma's hair. "Go to sleep now. We'll be back before you know it." The stagecoach journey was grueling: 2 days of dust, jolting roads, and cramped quarters. Matthew maintained a respectful distance, physically and conversationally, giving Grace space to prepare herself mentally for the confrontation with Thomas. Sacramento was larger and busier than Grace remembered from their brief stop there on their way to California years earlier. The jail was a substantial brick building in the center of town, its imposing facade making Grace's steps falter. "You don't have to do this," Matthew reminded her as they stood outside. Grace squared her shoulders. "Yes, I do, for Emma's sake if not my own." The interior was cool and dim after the bright sunshine outside. A uniformed guard led them down a corridor to a small room with a table and chairs, explaining that the prisoner would be brought in shortly. When the door opened again and Thomas Holloway was escorted in, Grace barely recognized her husband. His once robust frame had thinned, and his face was haggard with several days' growth of beard. The confident swagger she remembered had been replaced by the shuffling gait of a defeated man. His eyes widened at the sight of her, then narrowed as they shifted to Matthew standing protectively nearby. "Who's he?" Thomas demanded, his voice raspier than Grace remembered. "Matthew O'Brien," she replied calmly. "He's been helping me with Emma and the store." Thomas snorted. "Didn't take you long to replace me, did it?" Matthew stepped forward, but Grace placed a restraining hand on his arm. "You left us, Thomas. 3 months with no word, no money, nothing. Emma was desperately ill." The accusation seemed to deflate Thomas further. He sank into the chair opposite Grace, his shackled hands resting on the table. "I meant to come back. Had a run of bad luck in the mining camps. Then met some fellows who said they knew an easy way to make money." He trailed off, the consequences of that decision evident in their surroundings. "Why did you want to see me?" Grace asked, maintaining her composure through sheer force of will. Thomas leaned forward. "I need your help, Gracie. They're offering to reduce my sentence if I give up the names of the men I was working with. But those men have friends outside who'd kill me for talking." "So you want me to what? Help you escape?" Grace was incredulous. "No, no." Thomas glanced nervously at the door. "I need money for a good lawyer. If you sell the store, sell our livelihood." Grace interrupted, anger finally breaking through her calm facade. "The only thing keeping your daughter fed and clothed." Thomas had the grace to look ashamed. "I'm desperate here, Gracie." Matthew, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. "You abandoned your family when they needed you most, Holloway. You have no right to ask anything of Grace now." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "This isn't your business, Cowboy." "He made it his business when he stayed to care for the wife and child you deserted," Grace said, her voice steel. "When Emma was coughing so hard she couldn't breathe, when I was working myself to exhaustion trying to keep the store open." Thomas looked between them, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So that's how it is," he said bitterly. "You and the Cowboy." "There's nothing improper between us," Grace stated firmly, though the words felt hollow given the feelings she harbored for Matthew. "But he's shown more concern for Emma in 3 weeks than you did in the last year." Thomas was silent for a long moment, studying Grace's face. Whatever he saw there seemed to trigger a shift in him. His shoulders slumped, and when he spoke again, the belligerence had left his voice. "You're right," he admitted. "I was a poor excuse for a husband and father long before I left Calico." He rubbed a hand over his face. "The truth is, I didn't come back because I was ashamed. Couldn't face you empty-handed again." The honesty, unexpected as it was, touched something in Grace. This was closer to the Thomas she had married, capable of reflection, if not always wise choices. "Emma asks about you," she said, softer now. "She deserves better than a father she only knows through stories and fading memories." Thomas nodded, a shimmer of tears in his eyes. "I've ruined everything, haven't I?" It wasn't really a question. "What do you want, Thomas?" Grace asked directly. "Beyond money for a lawyer," he looked up, meeting her gaze squarely. "A divorce," he said simply. "You deserve a fresh start, Gracie. Both of you do." His eyes flickered to Matthew, who stood watching the exchange with careful neutrality. "Even if it's with him." The word divorce hung in the air, simultaneously threatening and liberating. In many circles, it was still considered scandalous, but in the West, practical considerations often trumped social conventions. "And Emma?" Grace asked, her primary concern always for her daughter. "I'd like to write to her," Thomas said. "Be as much of a father as I can from in here. Maybe someday when she's older she could visit." He gave a sad smile. "But she needs a man who's there for her every day, not just in letters." Grace felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that Thomas wasn't fighting to maintain a claim on her, sadness for what might have been, hope for what could be. "I'll speak to a lawyer about the divorce," she said finally. "But I won't sell the store. It's Emma's future." Thomas nodded, accepting the terms. Would you tell Emma I'm sorry, that I love her?" "I will," Grace promised, rising to her feet. "Goodbye, Thomas." As they left the jail, Matthew remained silent, allowing Grace to process the unexpected turn of events. They walked several blocks before she finally spoke. "He's not the man I married," she said quietly, "but I think at the end there I saw a glimpse of him again." Matthew nodded. "He did right by you, offering the divorce." "It's what I wanted," Grace admitted. "But I never thought he'd suggest it himself." They reached the hotel where they'd booked separate rooms for the night. As they stood in the lobby, the awareness of their changed circumstances hung between them, the potential removal of the barrier that had kept them apart. "What happens now?" Matthew asked, his voice low. Grace met his eyes, allowing herself to acknowledge the feelings she'd been holding at bay. "Now we go home to Emma. We talk to a lawyer, and we see what might be possible once everything's settled." Matthew's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "I can be a patient man, Grace Holloway." "Good," she replied, a matching smile forming on her lips, "because I think you may need to be." The journey back to Calico was charged with a new energy possibility hovering on the horizon like the promise of dawn. They spoke more freely, planning the garden by the spring, discussing improvements to the store, imagining a future together that now seemed within reach. "Emma will be overjoyed," Grace said as the stagecoach rattled along the final stretch of road toward Calico. "She's been asking when you'd officially become part of our family." Matthew's expression softened. "Smart girl, you're Emma." "Our Emma," Grace corrected gently, testing the word. "If that's what you want." Matthew's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "It's all I want, Grace. You and Emma. A home. Roots planted firmly enough to weather any storm." The legal process of ending her marriage to Thomas took longer than Grace had anticipated. Nearly 6 months of correspondence with lawyers, filing of papers, and waiting for court dates. Throughout it all, Matthew remained steadfast, neither pushing for declarations nor withdrawing his support. He moved into a small room behind the blacksmith shop, maintaining propriety while the divorce proceedings continued. But he took his meals with Grace and Emma, helped in the store, and gradually became indispensable to the townspeople of Calico as well. His medical knowledge, limited though it was, made him the closest thing to a doctor the town had, and his willingness to help with everything from broken wagon wheels to colicky babies endeared him to everyone. Emma blossomed under his attentive care. When she received her first letter from Thomas, Matthew helped her compose a response, showing neither judgment nor resentment toward the man who had abandoned her. The simple kindness of that act confirmed what Grace already knew: Matthew O'Brien was the finest man she'd ever known. As summer faded into autumn, the garden they'd planted by the spring yielded a surprising abundance. On a golden October afternoon, Matthew invited Emma and Grace for a picnic among the pumpkins they'd grown. Emma ran ahead, her copper hair so like her mother's streaming behind her as she searched for the perfect pumpkin to carve for Halloween. Grace and Matthew followed more slowly, their hands occasionally brushing as they walked. "Got something to show you," Matthew said, leading Grace toward a cluster of trees beyond the garden. As they rounded the bend, Grace gasped. A small cabin stood in a clearing, its wooden walls freshly constructed, a stone chimney rising along one side. A porch wrapped around the front with a swing hanging from sturdy chains. "Matthew," Grace whispered, turning to him in wonder. "Been working on it during evenings with help from Miller and some of the other men," he explained, a hint of nervousness in his voice. "It's not fancy, but it's solid." 3 rooms inside figured Emma should have her own space as she grows. Grace moved closer to the cabin, running her hand along the smooth wood of a porch post. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "But why? Because I'm hoping it might be our home," Matthew said, his voice deepening with emotion. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This came yesterday." Grace took it with trembling fingers. Inside was a legal document confirmation that her divorce from Thomas Holloway was final, granted by a judge in Sacramento County. "I'm free," she whispered, looking up at Matthew with tears shimmering in her eyes. He nodded, taking her hands in his. "Which is why I built this, why I'm asking you now." He sank to one knee, his green eyes never leaving her face. "Grace Holloway, I've loved you since the day I walked into your store and saw you fighting so bravely for your daughter. I love Emma like she's my own. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Grace's heart felt too full for her chest. "Yes," she said simply, joyfully. "Yes, Matthew O'Brien. 1,000 times yes." He rose and gathered her in his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. When they parted, both breathless and smiling, Emma's voice called from the garden. "Mama, Mr. O'Brien." I found the biggest pumpkin ever. They turned, hands still linked, to see Emma struggling to lift an enormous orange pumpkin. Matthew laughed and called back, "Leave that monster be, Emma. I'll help you with it in a moment." Looking back at Grace, his expression grew tender. "I should warn you, I asked Emma's permission before building the cabin. She had quite a few specifications for her bedroom." Grace laughed, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Of course she did. She's her mother's daughter." "And soon to be her father's as well," Matthew said softly. "If she'll have me." "She already considers you her father in all the ways that matter," Grace assured him. "But we should tell her together." They walked hand in hand back to where Emma waited, impatient beside her pumpkin discovery. Kneeling beside her, they shared their news, watching as her face transformed with joy. "Really?" she squealed, throwing her arms around Matthew's neck. "You're going to be my papa for real?" "If that's what you want, little one," Matthew said, his voice husky with emotion. "It's what I wished for," Emma confided. "Every night when I say my prayers, for you to stay forever." Over Emma's head, Matthew's eyes met Grace's, both of them moved by the child's simple, heartfelt declaration. "Forever it is, then," he promised. They were married 2 weeks later in Calico's small church, with Emma proudly serving as flower girl. The entire town turned out for the celebration, tables groaning with potluck contributions, and a dance that lasted well into the night. As Matthew led Grace in a waltz under stars that seemed to have been polished specially for the occasion, he whispered, "Did you ever think, when I walked into your store that day, that we'd end up here?" Grace shook her head, her white dress catching the light of the lanterns strung around the town square. "I was just grateful for help with Emma. I never imagined I'd find love again." "I knew," Matthew confessed, his arms tightening around her waist. "Not right away, perhaps. But when I saw how fiercely you loved Emma, how you faced each day with such courage despite everything, I was lost." He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Best decision I ever made, telling that cattle drive they'd have to manage without me." "Then I'll stay till you're both well," Grace quoted his words from that first day. "Except you never left." "And I never will," he promised. The next spring brought new beginnings. The garden by the spring expanded, providing not just for their family but produce to sell in the store. Emma, now fully recovered from her illness, started school and thrived under the combined love of her mother and her new father. Matthew's reputation as a healer grew, and though he was careful to make clear he wasn't a trained doctor, his knowledge of basic medicine and herbal remedies made him invaluable to the community. Grace's store prospered as well, becoming a gathering place for townspeople and travelers alike. On a warm June evening, as they sat on their porch swing watching Emma chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Matthew placed his hand gently on Grace's rounded belly. "Still set on naming him after my father if it's a boy?" he asked, wonder in his voice as he felt the baby shift beneath his palm. Grace covered his hand with hers. "James O'Brien has a fine sound to it, and if it's a girl, Hope," Matthew finished for her, "because that's what brought us together." Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Thomas hadn't left, if Emma hadn't gotten sick, if you hadn't ridden into Calico that day." Matthew pressed a kiss to her hair. "Some things are meant to be, Grace, through whatever twisting paths life takes us." As Emma ran back to them, her small hands cupping a captured firefly, its glow illuminating her delighted face, Grace knew Matthew was right. Their journey hadn't been straightforward. It had been marked by abandonment, illness, and uncertainty, but it had led them here, to this perfect moment of family and love. "Look," Emma exclaimed, opening her hand slightly to show them the twinkling insect. "Isn't it beautiful?" "It is," Grace agreed, making room for Emma on the swing between them. "But you should let it go now. Beautiful things need their freedom." Emma nodded solemnly and released the firefly, watching as it rose into the twilight air, its intermittent light joining others in the gathering darkness. "Like us," Matthew said softly, his arm extending across the back of the swing to encompass both Grace and Emma. "Free to choose our path, to build our life together." "I choose this," Grace replied, her heart full as she looked at her daughter and husband silhouetted against the sunset. "Every day, I choose this." As darkness settled fully over their little cabin, stars appearing one by one in the vast desert sky, the O'Brien family remained on their porch swing, bound together by love that had begun with a simple act of kindness and blossomed into a lifetime commitment. The cowboy who had promised to stay until they were well had given them something far more precious: a home, a family, and a love strong enough to weather any storm the frontier might bring their way. And in the years that followed, through the birth of their son James and daughter Hope, through Calico's boom and eventual decline as the silver played out, through Emma's growth into a beautiful young woman who inherited her mother's strength, and her father's compassion, Matthew and Grace O'Brien remained each other's anchors, their love a testament to the unexpected ways healing can come when we least expect it but need it most. Their story became something of a legend in that corner of California, the tale of a cowboy who rode into town and found not just a woman and child in need of help, but his own heart's home. In a land where men often drifted like tumbleweeds, Matthew O'Brien had planted roots deep enough to sustain not just himself, but an entire family tree that would spread its branches for generations to come. And it had all begun with 8 simple words spoken from a stranger's heart. "Then I'll stay till you're both well."